Hi folks and welcome back to another video. My name is Shah and this is Thoroughly Enjoyed Books. Today I'm bringing you some more of my reviews for the Women's Prize Longlist that I have been working my way through. At the point of me filming this video, the shortlist has been announced, so you can go and catch my thoughts on the shortlist in my last video. I will leave a link up above and down below. Definitely go and check that out. I don't go too into depth with reviews of the books, but talk a little bit about whether I agree or disagree with the list. And then in this video I'm going to be talking about another 5 books that I read. So I've got 4 here that I have out of the library and need to get back as soon as I finish this video, and I have 1 more that I listen to on audio. Without further ado, I'm going to jump right into my reviews and let you know my thoughts on the next 5 books. And I'll be doing 1 more of these videos just as soon as I have finished reading the long list. At this point I've read 14 of them, so there's only 2 more to go. And because I only have 2 more to go, that video should be coming up pretty soon. The first book I'm going to talk to you about today is Soldier Sailor by Claire Kilroy. In my last video I kept calling this Soldier, and I'm not sure why, but it's definitely Soldier Sailor. And this is a story about a woman who is talking to her child after she has gone through a really awful time following having her first child. So it explores the early years of motherhood, postnatal depression and mental health, and the difficulties and loss of identity when one becomes a mother, and how difficult it is to raise a child and all the complex emotions that she has. Claire Kilroy is an acclaimed Irish author, and this is her first book in over 10 years. I've not read on any of her other books, but I've heard this was really highly anticipated, and I've heard some really good reviews about this book, and I think they are very well deserved and well earned. So as I said, this book looks at the difficulties of becoming a mother, and it looks at the relationship of mother and father and how they experience the birth of a child and the raising of a child very differently. She loses her identity, she loses her further for work, she loses her friendship circles, and everything that she once believed in herself she no longer has. She has a very highly respectable job. I think both of them are doctors, and they're both very intelligent. But that also makes this book quite shocking and overwhelming when you realise just how seriously unwell the narrator is. We're never given any names for the characters. We are given Soldier for the mother and Sailor for the baby boy, and then her friends are just referred to as my friend. So we never have those names, and it makes it quite impersonal a lot of the time. That also makes it more captivating and more feverish, and it means it's almost more relatable. I'm not a mother myself, and I have a lot of worries myself about becoming a mother potentially in the future. I find it quite a terrifying concept. Not just childbirth, but also the things that this book explores and the risks of postnatal depression and the loss of identity, the loss of friendships and friendship circles. I almost found reading it quite prophetic. I was thinking, oh shit, is this what I have to look forward to? And I felt like that about another book on the long list as well, which sadly didn't make it, that I'll be reviewing in the next video. But I found that by not naming any of these characters, it made me feel that even more empathy, and helped put me in the shoes of the characters more than if she was called, I don't know, Margaret, and we were reading Margaret's story. It was nameless. It just made it so difficult to read. I guess the main thing I could say about this book is it's devastating. But coming back to what I was saying about her being a doctor and losing her identity, so there's a scene in the book where the baby hits its head on the floor, and she doesn't take the baby to hospital because she's a doctor and she knows the signs of concussion and internal bleeding, etc. And when her husband comes home, he's furious at her for not taking the baby to hospital, and has to remind him over and over again that she is a doctor, she knows what she's doing, she knows the signs that she's looking out for. And there are a couple of scenes like that that really stick out for me, scenes where her intelligence and her knowledge are kind of undermined, and she feels almost reduced to a mother, and that she shouldn't have these opinions, and that she shouldn't be using her own common sense and her own judgment. She should be doing everything as if she doesn't know anything about this baby. There's a scene where her husband is driving quite erratically during an argument, and how this is something that has always been an issue in their relationship, because every time she tells him this is something that bothers her, he doesn't listen, and now that there's a baby in the car, she wants him to pay even more attention to her, but simply doesn't. And the other scene that sticks out in my head is her meeting her friend at the park, and her friend has 3 children, and she wonders how on earth he did it, and it almost gives her that motivation to continue and persevere through, because there are times where she wants to give up and doesn't want to be a mother anymore, and has some really distressing thoughts about her own life and her child's life. But that hope that it does get better, it does get easier, and almost bringing that connection back into her life, having something more than just being somebody's mother, also being a friend again, and being able to bounce ideas off somebody and talk to somebody, really shines through, and we see a different personality around the friend. It was interesting to me that it was a male friend, because it could almost be depicted as a romantic partner. She was potentially going to leave her husband for this friend, but I like that it didn't do that. It just highlighted what her husband wasn't doing compared to other fathers. And it's slightly terrifying that, you know, we saw their relationship beforehand and how wonderful the relationship was before having a baby, and she thought he'd be a wonderful father, and just what she's ended up with is the complete opposite to what she thought she was going to get. Very, very terrifying. So I just found it, like I said, to be a very overwhelming, very feverish read, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I can 100% see why this made it onto the shortlist. I will say that I listened to it in audiobook, and that made it almost more frantic, I think, because I listened to my audiobooks on double speed. So I'd be interested to see how I relate to this book if I read it physically with my eyes. And I might do that at some point. I am considering rereading the entire shortlist so that I can really sit with my thoughts on them. The next book I'm going to talk about is Night Bloom by Peace Adzo Mehdi. This was actually the first book that I started on the long list, because I had it out of the library already when it was announced. However, this is the 8th book that I'm talking about in my long list reviews. That's how long it took me to read this book. And I'm not going to lie, I had to listen to the audiobook to finish it, otherwise it was probably going to be a DNF. Which is really a shame, because I do think there's a lot of merit in this book, and I think there's a lot to think about, and I am still thinking about it now. When I was writing up my notes for this book, I was thinking, oh my gosh, it does this, it does that, it does that. But my enjoyment of it just was pretty low, I have to admit. This book follows 2 cousins, Selassie and Akorfa. And they are from very different backgrounds. Akorfa's family is quite well off, quite well educated, and Selassie's family are less so. So when Selassie's mother dies, Akorfa's family take her under their wing and raise her, and Selassie seems to be quite ungrateful. And then they go their separate ways until much later, when the pair are reconnected and we see the story from Selassie's point of view. So I won't tell you exactly what goes on in this book. What I will say is a big part of it is education. So Akorfa is very well educated, she's very smart, she gets into all the good schools, the good secondary school that she had to pass a test to get into. She ends up going to a prestigious university, even if it's not Yale or Harvard like she intended, to study science. At the same time, Selassie is not as academic as Akorfa at all. She does manage to get into some good schools by the skin of her teeth, and mostly because of who Akorfa's dad is. He manages to pull a few strings because he's got quite a good job. And then Akorfa goes into like politics and social sciences and all that kind of thing. Whereas Selassie ends up doing home economics and ends up going down quite stereotypical gendered life. What I really did like about this book is the fact that we got different sides of the story. So about half of the book is Akorfa's story, and then the second half of the book is Selassie recounting her side of the story. And we see how, despite reading the same story twice, we end up getting 2 very different accounts, and how it looks at how perspective is everything, and how little bits of information being missing can be devastating for relationships, and the lack of communication, and how professional jealousy and lack of empathy and lack of understanding can really come in between relationships. I really liked reading about when they were older, and particularly in Selassie's story, it gets really political as she tries to stand up and be more brave and to tear down the barriers that have always been in her way, but because of her position she is pushed down and tried to be pushed back into boxes that she just doesn't fit in. So it's very political in that way. However, I do think it got really outrageous. I mean, the last 50 pages of this book, I would say there was a storyline that I just thought was completely and utterly ridiculous. It made the whole book feel silly. I didn't like it. I won't spoil what that is, but it was kind of a revenge plot. I thought it was over the top. For how serious the rest of the novel was, it kind of was a bit silly. I also, like I said, wasn't a huge fan of this book. I found it quite dull. I thought the pacing was completely off. There were times when I really enjoyed what I was reading, and then other times where I just wanted scenes to end and move on to something new. So I think that was the downfall of this book, but I can also see why it didn't make it. And I personally wouldn't have put it on the shortlist either. I think the faults that I had with it were too glaring for me to say this deserved the shortlist. But I know a lot of people who did really enjoy this. I was really disappointed not to like this one more because, like I said, I already had it out of the library when it was announced as being on the long list, so I was interested in reading it before then. Also, massive trigger warning in this for child rape and sexual exploitation. That was rough. Not as rough as in River East, River West though. That was in quite a few books actually this year. The next book I'm going to talk about, I'm actually only going to talk about it very briefly because I don't think my review of it will do any justice, because this book has been longlisted for so many awards. It's been shortlisted for some of the biggest awards. Lots of people really love this book, and I just didn't get it, and that is Western Lane by Chetna Maru. This is a book that looks at grief. It follows a family whose matriarch dies, and we follow the father and his 3 daughters through that grieving process. Part of that process is that the father and his 11-year-old daughter Gopi get really obsessed with squash, and this is all about the build-up to a squash tournament that Gopi really wants to partake in, but it is told against the backdrop of this whole family dealing with this grief and recognising the mother's absence, and all 3 of the daughters just not really being able to express that in the best way. And I also can't talk too much about the rest of the plot of this book and explain my thoughts because of how short it is. It's 160 pages. If I say anything more about that plot, it will end up spoiling the book in more ways than one. So like I said, I'm going to keep this very brief. There are some beautiful scenes in this book that deal with grief. There are some lovely moments where I could almost see why this book was so beloved. But again, it's something that just fell flat to me. I, again, found it quite dull. I didn't find the writing particularly spectacular. It was okay, and that's all I really have to say about it. But like I said, I know there must be something in this book because so many people have raved about it. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and I think what it does do in the short amount of time you have with it, it does really well. But I don't necessarily think it's anything spectacular, and I actually struggle talking about it now because I don't remember much about it, and I should be able to remember more about it when I put it down. I didn't get through this particularly fast. It took me a while to read it, but none of it stuck with me, and that's a shame. However, the last 2 books that I'm going to talk to you about today, I really enjoyed. One of them, I had to do an extensive Google about what it was actually about in a bit more depth to be able to talk about it. But the other one I loved, and I haven't written notes because I just want to talk about it. And that is In Defence of the Act by Effie Black. Devastated this one isn't on the shortlist, let me just point out. And I think a lot of people are as well. I think this was like a black horse book. I think a lot of people were a bit tentative going into it, unsure whether they were going to read it because of the content, which is basically suicide. This whole book is about suicide and what the purpose of suicide is, and asking questions about whether suicide has an evolutionary purpose, whether suicide is necessary in human life. It looks at animals in particular and how a lot of different animals and insects and bugs need suicide to thrive, and it's a survival technique for some of them. So some bugs, I think it talked about spiders, will sacrifice themselves, and how other bugs like mantises, for example, know that evolutionary they're going to die after mating, but they have to mate to continue the species. So that was really interesting. But we follow Jessica, who is a queer character. She is a lesbian who finds her father unconscious when she's about 4 or 5 years old at the start of the book, and he has attempted to take his own life, and she's the one who finds him and lets her mother know. And from there, she becomes fascinated with suicide because her father was quite abusive, and she wonders, would it have been better if he had died? However, there are other instances in her life where friends die and friends are in pain due to illnesses, where she wonders, is it really a necessity? And then there is another instance of suicide where Jess begins to question if everything she's learned is a lie. It's quite a difficult read. It's quite harrowing at times. The depth it looks into suicide with are at equal times fascinating and distressing. Statistics and things are brought up because Jess is a PhD student researching suicide, so it's not like she's just interested in Googling things. I imagine a lot of research went into this book, but despite that content and how dark that sounds, it's strangely humorous. We follow Jessie's relationships, and particularly one serious relationship she had that broke down due to her desire not to have children, and it looks at whether or not that was a decision she could have changed. And I guess it looks at whether our ideas are static or whether they're dynamic and our beliefs and our morals can change. That's what I took away from this book. But I love Jess as a character. There's a beautiful scene that I won't harp on about because everyone talks about it in their reviews, but a beautiful scene at a book club where they are talking about a book that sounds like A Little Life. The book is obviously not named, but there are some big hints that the book is A Little Life, and we are sitting in kind of like a round table discussion as people discuss it, and we get Jessie's thoughts on it as well. And I just thought that was a really amazing scene, particularly the exploration of queer experiences in that moment. At no point did this book feel like I was being slapped in the face with facts and morality and opinions. It was just an exploration. I've heard a few people say that the writing was a little bit clunky in this, and I can certainly see that at very few points in the book, but I almost feel like because of what is happening in those parts, it's almost intentional, because Jessie's thoughts are becoming disrupted. She is questioning her entire moral compass, everything that she has ever believed and everything that she has spent her whole life studying. We are also following two timelines in this book, which I thought was really well done and reminded me a lot about How to Get Away with Murder, if you have seen that show, where right at the beginning of the series we see the end scene. We just don't know how we got there and who is actually involved in that. So it's a little bit backwards and forwards like that, and I really enjoyed it. It kind of built that momentum and kept me going. So that is something I really enjoyed in this book and would definitely recommend picking this one up. Like I said, very disappointed it didn't make the shortlist because this is a brilliant read. I think it's the boldest book on the long list. It definitely deserved a spot as far as I'm concerned. And then the last book that we will talk about today is The Wren by Anne Enright. A very polarising book. I've seen very mixed reviews on this one. I can kind of see why. So we have another Irish writer here. You all know that I love an Irish book. This has been compared a lot to Sally Rooney, and I can see why, but also I think it's very different to that. And you're going to have to bear with me while I explain this book because, like I said, I wasn't 100% sure what it was actually about, even when I finished it. But the main takeaway from this book is we have a poet called Phil McDarragh, who is the father of Carmel, who is one of our protagonists, and the grandfather of Nell, who's another protagonist in this novel. And we follow mostly Carmel and Nell, and actually mostly Carmel, but we also do get the odd chapter. It might even just be one chapter from Phil's point of view. And Phil was an acclaimed poet. He was famous for his love poetry, which depicted a life very different to the one he actually lived and the one that his family know him for. He cheated on his wife, he had several marriages, and he kind of just disappeared and abandoned his family. There is a line that stuck with me throughout this, and it made me think about, actually, this is a really common experience, but it was an interview that Phil had given following his divorce to Carmel's mother. I think she was called Dolores. I might have made that up, but I think she was called Dolores, who had been through, I think, cancer treatment. She'd become very ill. She'd gone through treatment, and then they divorced. And during this interview, he says that his wife got ill and his marriage couldn't survive that. And you hear about that so often, don't you, where a man can't deal with his wife being ill and leaves her. I know that is common. That is an opinion. That is a fact. I wish I had statistics on that, but it's so common. So that, I think, is the driving force of this book. Because of that, Carmel is very independent. She doesn't want anybody in her life to stick around. She accidentally finds herself pregnant with Nell and is determined to be a single mother. She gets into a serious relationship and feels very trapped in this. And we explore how her father's poetry has had an influence on that. On the flip side, we also have Nell, who is also in a difficult relationship that is, I would say, abusive, and especially sexually abusive in some aspects. But a lot of her grandfather's poetry also revolves around her. And we are given poems at the start of each section that kind of explain or surround the chapter that we're going to get, again to highlight how Phil demonstrated himself to the public in comparison to how the subjects of those poems actually feel about him. I enjoyed the reading experience of this. I found it very lyrical. I want to read it again because, like I said, I'm not 100% sure it all sank in, and I found it quite difficult to follow at times, which I can understand why people therefore say it shouldn't be on the shortlist, because one of the criteria for the prize is for it to be accessible, and I'm not sure this is. It's definitely one of the more literary on the shortlist, one that is a bit more difficult to read, but I think the poetry on its own is just absolutely stunning. Anne Enright could be a poet. I don't know if she is a poet. I don't know anything about her. I just know that she has won the prize before and she is longlisted pretty much every time she releases a new book. So she is kind of a women's prize darling. I've also been told that this isn't her best work and that there are other books better than this that she's written. So I'm interested to read some more of her books because I did enjoy this one, and if I enjoyed this one as much without really knowing much about it, even when I finished it, I'm sure some of her other books will blow me away. So those are my discombobulated thoughts on 5 more of the Women's Prize for Fiction longlist for 2024. Like I said, I only have 2 more books to read, and then I'll wrap up my thoughts on the last 5 that I haven't spoke about yet, and then I plan on doing some more in-depth videos about each individual book, sharing a bit more of my thoughts, like I said, potentially rereading them. So if you have read any of these books, I would love to know your thoughts on them. What are your thoughts on the shortlist? Are there any books that you would swap out? And please go and check out my video for more thoughts on that. I will also leave links down below to the last video I did talking about the first 6 books that I read. And I will also leave links down below to my Instagram and my Storygraph and all that good stuff, so you can come and follow me on there and talk to me about books. But that's everything for this video, and I'll see you in another one very, very soon. Take care. Bye!